Stuck trying to debug a Windows service? Let me show you something you can try. Once in a while, you might need to debug a Windows service using WinDBG. It's not really that difficult because Windows services are just regular executables, but sometimes you cannot attach to a service properly using WinDBG. Let me cover in this video how to attach to a Windows service that is already running and how to start a Windows service under a debugger. Let me start by switching to my remote machine in which I've already prepared a demo. So what I have is that I've written a Windows service, I'm calling it Windows Service 1, to be my sample service. This service does absolutely nothing. I wrote this service just to prove how you can attach the debugger to a Windows service. In this video, I won't cover the details how to write a Windows service. I will put a link in the description below for a tutorial on how to write a Windows service. But generally, once you have a Windows service and once it has been installed, you can debug any Windows service using WinDBG, but I chose to write a .NET service for this tutorial. Now, all Windows services are just executables. If I go to the properties over here, what I can see is that there is a path to the executable. In my case, it's just a sample service that I wrote called Windows Service 1. There is a startup type. I put manual because I want to press start by myself. And there is permissions over here, which is the logon permissions. This is where the problem starts. Because Windows services can either be a local system account or an account that I chose. In this case, I chose an account with this username over here. This causes problem with WinDBG. If we can change the account over here, it's a bit simpler, but let me show you what happens if you try to debug a service that has an account. So I'm going to start this service over here. I'm just going to press start. And what's going to happen is the service is going to load into memory and it's going to be running. Now, if I try to select that service in WinDBG, I'm just going to go here, I'm going to go to attach, and I'm going to find the service down here, Windows Service 1. I am using the 64-bit version of WinDBG because I compiled the program as a 64-bit .NET. You can use any version of WinDBG, but you have to match the binary. Just use 64-bit if you don't know what type the binary is, and then WinDBG will just tell you internally whether it's a 64 or 32. But I know mine is a 64, so I'm using the AMD 64 version of WinDBG. If I attach to Windows Service 1 over here, it's not going to work. It's just going to say access denied. There is a reason for that. It's because of the permissions. Let me just clear my screen over here. So the permission problem is because the Windows Service 1 is actually running as an account that does not have allow service to interact with desktop. This permission over here, allow service to interact with desktop, is applied to administrator level accounts. Now, technically, I can still attach WinDBG. What I need to do is, I need to actually run WinDBG as an administrator. So let me do that right now. If I run WinDBG as an administrator, this is gonna work. Because what will happen is, the administrator account actually has the permission to allow attaching and interacting with the desktop. So if I do that, it's gonna attach that waiting pending and it's gonna hit the debug break over here. Now, let me detach WinDBG and explain a bit more about what's exactly happening. The permission, even though the permission for the process is a regular user, if I launch WinDBG as an administrator, I will be able to override and get allow service to interact with desktop. If I change this permission to local system account and I use WinDBG as an administrator, it will also work. However, the problem is by doing that, I'm actually changing the permissions of the process or I'm changing the permissions of the debugger in order to achieve the debug. This might not always be possible, especially for the startup. So an example is, I can do this if the process is already running. So if the process is running as this user over here and I launch WinDBG and I attach to it, and WinDBG is an administrator WinDBG, everything's going to be fine. But what if I wanted to launch the process as this user and attach WinDBG? In that scenario, I can't actually do that because what will happen is WinDBG won't have the proper permission allow service to interact with desktop. Let me show you another way we can go about this, which is to actually launch the debugger as a service and get the debugger to then launch the service as any user that we want. What we will need is another debugger that does not need the permission to interact with desktop. And we actually do have another debugger. If we go to the WinDBG directory, in my case it's Windows Kit 10 debugger, 64-bit debugger, there is another debugger we can use, which is cdb, Console Debugger. cdb and WinDBG, they are the same thing. They are the same debugger. The difference is cdb does not have a user interface. It's meant to run in the console so that when you use this debugger, it does not require any additional permissions, it does not require any additional output, it does not draw a screen that is sophisticated, so it's very easy to automate. If we use cdb as the actual Windows service and we get cdb to open a connection to WinDBG, then we can use cdb as the debugger instead of the proper WinDBG. So let's go ahead and try that. So what we are going to do is we are going to register cdb as a Windows service. We're going to give it command line arguments so that it will launch the actual service we want. We are going to give it additional command line arguments to say that we want to open a network connection. And then finally, we're going to use WinDBG to connect to cdb. This way, cdb will actually launch the service as any permission that we want. So registering cdb is actually quite simple. I have prepared a command line argument over here in a batch file which registers cdb. So what we need to do is we need to run this executable called sc.exe. This is the service control. I will put a link in the description below on what service control is. This is the command that can create or delete Windows services from your Windows installation. Be cautious though. You need to run this command as an administrator. And it is possible to delete a service which you need, which is critical for Windows. So caution ahead, do not use this command to delete just anything. Be careful, you can delete something that's important. However, if we put it in a batch file, we can double check what we are doing and it will be quite safe because we are making sure that we only add or delete the service that we want. So let me go over how this command actually works. Let me make the window a bit easier to read over here. Okay, so let me just move it slightly like that. Okay, so sc.exe over here, this is the service control. Create is to create a new service. There is a command sc in PowerShell. That's not the one we are using. This is sc.exe. So run this script in a regular command prompt. You might have to run it as an administrator command prompt, but don't run it in PowerShell because sc conflicts with a different command in PowerShell. So sc create is create the Windows service. Windows service debug 2, that is the name of the service that we want. So that's the first parameter. Binpath equals, and we give it the path over here. This is the executable that we want to run. Notice that I'm putting Windows Kit 10 Debuggers x64 cdb.exe. Now the rest of the parameters are for cdb. Notice that I have quotes on the front and in the back. These double quotes are essential because of the spaces inside. Make sure you have one double quote here and one double quote here. So the parameters are, the first parameter we want is -server TCP:/port and give it a number. Give it a very high number above 10,000. I put 50,000. There's a reason for that in the permissions. Windows reserves some ports, so always put a very high port. Make sure this port is opened by the firewall. I'll put a link in the description below of how to enable the port in the firewall. If you run this command, sometimes Windows will prompt and say, do you want to open the port for the firewall? Just put yes. You only need to do this once. So any open port is fine. The syntax to open a server, I'll put a link in the description below as well for the syntax on how to open a server connection. The final parameter, that's pretty simple. The full path to the executable that we want to run. Make sure it's the full path. Because when cdb runs, it does not actually run from this path over here. It runs from a base path. Don't take the risk that it's running from a place that we don't know about. Put the full path to the executable that we want. Once you have done this and run this command, you should have the Windows service. So let's go ahead and run the command. Now to run the command, I'm using an administrator command prompt. Try not to use PowerShell for this command because sc.exe conflicts with something in PowerShell. So if I run install cdb.bat, I'm going to get an error that says the specified service already exists. That's because I ran this earlier. The first time you run it, it's going to say success and it's going to give you a code to say, I think it says success 200 or something like that. If it says success, you should have the Windows service. Mine says specified service already exists because, well, it does. So that's why it says already exists. I didn't want to delete and recreate this over and over again because Windows has some requirement where you have to reboot if you delete the service. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this service and try to use it to debug. Now, if we take a look at the service properties, we are going to get that the path to the executable is here and you get the full parameters over here. What we can do is we can go to logon and we can actually change the logon to whatever user account we want. Because now this is going to be the account that CDB runs at. So I'm going to use a regular user account to prove that it can be done, that CDB will launch as a regular user. It will then launch the service that we want and we will have a socket that we can use to debug. Let's get ready to run the service. I'm going to stop the Windows Service 1 over here so that we can use it to debug. Now, there's a bit of a caveat here. When you run CDB for the first time, it's going to start the executable and stop at the initial breakpoint. This means that Windows is going to detect that this service has timed out. The reason is when a service starts, it always informs Windows within 30 seconds that it has started. That's not going to happen when the service is stuck at the initial breakpoint. So within that window of 30 seconds, if we connect WinDBG to CDB, Windows won't know that the service had timed out. So we have a window to attach, which is 30 seconds. We need to attach WinDBG within that time. Let me get WinDBG ready so that we can attach it immediately as the socket opens. So what I do is I start my WinDBG. I'm starting the 64-bit WinDBG. It doesn't matter at this point because it's going to be a network connection. The actual debugger is CDB. So I can use any version of WinDBG I want because it's just going to be a network connection. What I do is I go to File, then I connect to remote session, and the remote session that I want is TCP:/port equals 50,000. The reason I put in port 50,000 is because that's the actual port number that I put into CDB in the arguments so that it will open a socket for port 50,000, a TCP socket. So with everything ready, let's do this really quick. So what I'll do is I will start the service over here, and just before it hangs, I'm going to press OK, and then I'm going to press G 2 times to make sure that the service keeps running. This way, Windows is happy. So if I go back to Windows over here, it says that the service is running, but if I go to WinDBG, it has already been attached. Now, if I inspect the services, it says Windows Service 1 is not running. That's correct because I didn't start it. Instead, what I did was I started Windows Service Debug 2, which is running the executable that I want. If I go to WinDBG over here and I break into this process over here and I take a look at just say the threads, I can actually see that all the threads are there. If I run LM over here, I'm going to get all the processes over here. There we are, Windows Service 1. This is the first process. And it's fully debuggable. I can even take memory dumps if I want. This version of WinDBG is not debugging the process at all. It's actually CDB that is running behind in the background. So what I did at the start was I pressed G 2 times. What I'm doing is G means go. I am telling the debugger to go as quickly as possible so that Windows doesn't detect the timeout. If you don't do that quickly, Windows will detect a timeout and kill the executable because Windows thinks that the process has failed or has not started accordingly. Let me just show you where the G is. So I would have pressed G 1 time over here and it will just go from the initial break. And what I did was I pressed G a second time in order to get to the prompt over here. It's just the initial breakpoint. You can actually pass in command line parameters to say you don't want initial breakpoints. That was a bit more sophisticated, so I did it this way so that I can show that it is possible to get it to attach, get it to start, and connect WinDBG all within the timeout period. Now, if this was a real problem in the process, I will just resume the process over here, and I can basically just monitor it, and if something bad happened, I could take a memory dump. This process does nothing, so even pausing it in memory does nothing because it was a process designed for the very purpose of being debugged. So there's nothing I can do over here. But this illustrates that it is possible to get a debugger to launch as any permission and launch a Windows service to be debugged by using a remote port. I have actually used this technique many times to debug Windows services. The core issue that this technique is trying to solve is launching the process as any permission. Launching a process as administrator works fine if you just want to attach WinDebug. But I've often found that you have to launch the process as maybe network system or some other kind of restricted permission in order to reproduce the defect. And so launching the debugger as the permission that I need has been very beneficial. So I kind of figured out this technique of opening the network socket so that you can attach to it. If you don't want to open a TCP port, you can use other commands like opening a name pipe or opening some other kind of remote connection. I will leave a link in the description below for all the different combinations that you can try, but I know that opening a socket definitely does work. Have you ever used this technique before? I have done it a lot. It's a bit tedious to set up, but once you figure out the commands how to do it, it's just one command, it's just register cdb as the actual debugger. It becomes pretty easy to do it, and you can even write installers to do it or any other technique to do it. It's very straightforward. Just remember, use cdb as the debugger, not WinDebug, and then attach WinDebug to cdb. There are other scenarios in which this also works, where you have executables that must run under obscure permissions that you cannot use WinDebug by itself. Just use cdb, attach to it, and then open a socket for WinDebug. Anyway, let me know in the comments below if you have actually used this technique before. And gentle reminder to subscribe, hit that bell icon, and give me a like if you like the content. It's been a pleasure bringing you this information. I am High Voice, signing out.